Hi, everybody. This is a talk that I gave in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge on the 7th of March of 2025, and I'm grateful to Marta Helena and Hasok Chang for the opportunity to have given that talk, and I'm recording it now because a few colleagues couldn't make it in person, and I'm really keen to get their feedback, and I thought I may as well make it generally accessible. This is also a talk that, in a slightly extended version of a talk that I gave at the 2024 virtual meetings of the Society for the Study of Evolution, so evolution.org, I think is the website. And all of that, I'll put a link to that talk in the comments. And there's also a manuscript that's been floating around to various journals for over a year now that summarizes the basic gist of what I'm saying. Okay, so that's a bit of a preamble. You can see on the title slide here basically the four parts of the talk, the title of which, of course, is Ronald Verschuer and Group Selection. So I'm going to start out with a bit of history and definition, telling you what I think group selection is. And we can start in the 1960s, actually before then, but I happen to have a quote here from a book, the English translation of which is called On Aggression, written in German by Konrad Lorenz a few years before, English translation 1966, and I'll just read a little bit to you. The most important function of rival fighting in these cervids that you're looking at on the slide is the selection of an aggressive family defender, and this presupposes a further function, namely brood defense. This is so obvious that it requires no further comment. So that is what, not too much after the 60s, became known as naive group selection, because at least the proximate mechanism that really explains aggressive behavior in male cervids of the kind you're looking at in this slide is not brood defense, it's individual fitness. And so many commentators, such as John Maynard Smith, many years later, Maynard Smith, of course, one of the giants of evolutionary biology, in a different context, writing a fairly critical book review in the late 90s, referred to this sort of naive group selection and pointed out that, the sort of mathematics behind that and demonstrating that it really is an individual level effect was famously developed by Maynard Smith and George Price and other giants like Bill Hamilton. And Maynard Smith points out in this other quote that I have here that when Price and I proposed our model of animal fighting, we were combating the then prevalent idea, namely naive group selection of the kind that Konrad Lorenz is talking about. So that's one way to think about group selection in a naive way that, well, Konrad Lorenz isn't here to defend himself, but suffice it to say that that's pretty widely held in contemporary behavioral ecology, that the reason why male deer fight is really about individual fitness. It's not about, some high-level unit above the individual. Okay, another early manifestation of this term group selection took place long before Konrad Lorenz, and this is from Verschuer himself, and the frontispiece of that 1930 book, first edition, Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, is of these butterflies. You see a heliconius butterfly there that has a distasteful quality, a toxic quality as a predator deterrent. This is another distasteful butterfly, and immediately adjacent in both cases, these are not butterflies, this is a moth here, and that's another moth here, and those are both mimics. They mimic the color patterns of that distasteful butterfly so that any predator who's learned to avoid the butterfly will also avoid the moth. And at least in the case of heliconius, that moth is not actually toxic. It's a what's called a Batesian mimic. So it benefits from the avoidance that the predators learn to avoid the butterfly, but it doesn't actually contain at least the same distasteful ingredients that the butterfly does. So Verschuer reasonably observed that this is a bit of a puzzle. And he writes in 1930, it's difficult to perceive how individual increments of the distasteful quality beyond the average level of the species could confer any individual advantage. If you taste just a teeny bit bad, you're still going to be gobbled up by a predator. He solved this conundrum insofar as he referred to, and I quote, the gregarious habit of certain larvae. He didn't use the phrase kin selection. Kin selection came into play many decades later, really in the 60s, but he's basically talking about the same thing, right? So I'll just read to you a little bit. With gregarious larvae, the effect will certainly be to give the increased protection, especially to one particular group of larvae, probably brothers and sisters of the individual attacked, right? So here you do get a means by which individual gradations, even though the individual that is being attacked is not going to survive, the gregarious brood members will. And you can just make out, perhaps, that whoever, this is the version of the Fisher 1930 that's on archive.org, and whatever, I think University of Toronto Library, some patron shamelessly wrote in the margin, kin selection, because of course that's exactly what that is. Okay, here's another example of a group level phenomenon, and this is something that that has been written about a fair amount by a number of authors, very sympathetic, I think rightfully so, to this notion of high-level selection. You might call it group selection. And the question posed is, if you're a poultry farmer, do you, you're a poultry farmer, you want to increase your productivity of your hens. You could decide to pick the most productive hens, stick them all together on your industrial poultry farm and see what happens, or you could select for productive groups of hens. And the only way to succeed as a poultry farmer is if you pick B. And this is a paper by Muir in the mid-90s who demonstrated this. And if, hopefully none of you are buying your eggs from industrial farms, none of my business actually, but in any event, when you house aggressive hens together, you tend to have to debeak them, which is a very invasive process. It's very stressful for the animals. But if you're a group selectionist, or you would take the advice of Muir in 1996 and select productive groups of hens, then you don't have to do that. And the general context is that a hen is productive not only by virtue of her individual qualities, but the social context, right? So there's a certain hierarchy of aggression, and evidently, I'm not a poultry farmer or a poultry biologist, but I'm just repeating what Muir wrote in his papers in the 90s. You need submissive hens, or at least a wide distribution of aggressive hens combined with literally hens lower in the pecking order to have your poultry farm succeed. That is an effect of the group on individual fitness that I think is a legitimate example of group selection. Okay, let's take another example of a group level effect, and that is the ratio between males and females in a sexually reproducing species. So note, I'm not talking about the origin of sexual reproduction, nor am I talking about the maintenance of sexual reproduction. I'm talking about the factors that lead to this widespread tendency. It's not universal, there are many exceptions, but more often than not, for a given species, we tend to find an equal number of males and females. Why is that? Well, this is a very famous figure from George Williams' influential book from the mid-1960s, Adaptation and Natural Selection, in which he, like John Maynard Smith in the quote I mentioned before, is combating what they would call naive group selection, the sort of Conrad Lorenz idea that male deer fight to become brood defenders, operating at a level above the individual. Williams took the different expectations. What would you expect if, the point of group level phenomena was, well, he gives three options here. Maybe the species wants to regulate its population size. Maybe male leopards kill all the cubs when they take over a pride. Because they anticipate future resource scarcity. If that were the case, then here's a population density on the x-axis. If your population isn't that dense, then actually you don't really want too many males, right? So that's the y-axis is proportion of males. It's pretty low. If your population is pretty sparse, then you want more females so that you can recover your population. On the other hand, if you have a really dense population, you're in danger of outstripping your resources. So there you do want lots of males. So that's the prediction that Williams discussed. Here's another prediction. If the goal of a group is to maximize the size of the next generation, come what may, well, then the expectation is a bit different. You might expect a 50-50 sex ratio when your population is sparse, because when two individuals do run into each other, and remember, if your population is sparse, the odds of that happening are pretty low, but when they do run into each other, you better hope that it's a male and a female. So having 50-50 sex ratio works towards that end, whereas you don't need to worry so much about males and females meeting when you have a very dense population, because they're going to do that anyways. And of course, in that case, you want to have lots of females, because that's the way, males are useless for increasing population size. You really need females to do that. And what Williams observed is actually more often than not in nature, regardless of population density, we find a 50-50 sex ratio. And that is this individual level, right? You're maximizing the individual reproduction with a 50-50 sex ratio. And this is something that Fisher himself pointed out, very simply because if you're maximizing individual reproductive fitness, and if you are the mother who gives birth to a member of the rare sex, if you give birth to a female in a world of males, or vice versa, you are going to have much higher fitness. Your offspring, as a member of the rare sex, will have no trouble finding mates. So you expect the greater the rarity, the greater the fitness advantage, and so you end up with this sort of expectation of an asymptote, with the fitness advantage dropping off the closer you get to a 50-50 sex ratio. And indeed, that is something that Williams drew on, and Fisher has been credited, rightfully so, with really articulating this notion of a frequency-dependent selection, right? The fitness of your offspring is dependent on the frequency of some trait that's present in the population. In this case, it will be the ratio of males to females. Okay, so a couple of these examples that I've told you about, frequency-dependent selection plus kin selection, right? Kin selection was the gregarious habits of butterfly larvae, frequency-dependent selection, sex ratios, just to pick two of them. This combination has historically, and in some quarters to this day, been regarded as basically disproving the group as an important unit of natural selection. And I suppose if your idea of group selection is naive, it's a bit of a straw man, but I'm just repeating what the textbooks say to some extent, then I think that's true. So the concept of this sort of average effects of frequency-dependent selection plus kin selection really in the literature has been boiled down to what sometimes is called the gene's eye view, right? And here's just a very brief quote from David Sloan Wilson and Ed Wilson back in 2007. Gene's eye view is a perspective in which everything that evolves is interpreted as a form of genetic selfishness. And Ronald Fisher is often regarded as really the godfather of that perspective. Here are just a few quotes from the literature. So, for example, Orrin Harmon, really wonderful biography of George Price. It's a great title, The Price of Altruism. Those of you who know something about the role that George Price played in mathematically coming to grips with this concept of altruism, you really should read Orrin Harmon's biography. It's really good. However, he does do Fisher a bit of an injustice, I think, as I'll make the case throughout the talk. When Harmon wrote on page 170 of his 2011 biography of Price that, and I quote, George Williams, the influential author from the 1966 book Adaptation to Natural Selection, Williams found what he needed to, quote, kill group selection, end quote, buried in a paragraph in Fisher, 1930, and he was referring to Fisher's discussion of mimicry and toxicity in butterflies. Here's a 1999 book called Unto Others by Elliot Sober and David Sloan Wilson, and I quote, Wright, in reference to Sewell Wright, another famous evolutionary biologist, population geneticist from the 20th century, thought that group selection was probably an important force in nature, whereas Ronald Fisher, accorded it little significance. We'll come back to that Wright versus Fisher debate a little later. And then Egbert Lee, in a paper that I otherwise really liked a lot, from Trends in Ecology and Evolution, I think in 1999, Egbert Lee writes, and I quote, Fisher argued that natural selection is driven by individual advantage, not the good of the group or the species. I mean, there is an element of truth to all of these quotes insofar as Fisher never was associated with naive group selection, but they do, I think they all are making a mistake, as I'll try to bolster that thought in a moment. Before I do, though, I can't not mention altruism. This is the sort of counterintuitive phenomenon that we see in the natural world all over the place. And if you're an individual selectionist, how could it possibly be that you reduce or forego altogether your own reproductive fitness in favor of that of someone else? And the sort of evolutionary gene's eye view explanation of altruism is generally credited to Bill Hamilton from a couple of famous papers from the early 60s. And the Hamiltonian interpretation of gene's eye view of kin selection in particular as how you get altruistic qualities really is made yet more impressive when you realize the method of sex determination in wasps, bees, ants, other hymenopteran social insects, not termites as it turns out, but it is true with the hymenopterans, namely that here you see a queen ant with a couple of her workers. Well, the workers hatch from fertilized eggs. The drones, the males, hatch from unfertilized eggs. So that male drone, all of his gametes, all of his sperm are genetically identical. He is a haploid individual. And so that male, when he's fertilizing an egg that will give rise to a daughter, right, those daughters will have exactly the same contribution paternally amongst each other, whereas maternally their eggs are gametes, that result from meiosis in the normal way. So they're mixing the genetic attributes of the mother, and so they're not genetically identical. So what that means is that the average sister relatedness is actually 0.75. Sister hymenopterans have more genetically in common with each other than they do with their mother. So from a gene's eye view perspective, it makes total sense that, ants will sacrifice their own genetic offspring, their own fitness, because they want their mother to give them more sisters. They have more in common with those sisters genetically than they would with their own daughters. So that was another really compelling aspect of the gene's eye view that pretty much, led to this sort of rejection of group selection, at least naive group selection from the 60s onwards. Okay, so the context in which I've been discussing these examples of group selection, whether it's poultry farming or toxicity in butterflies, we can fit that into a larger concept known as multi-level selection, right? So group selection is just one kind of multi-level selection. And I want to give due credit to a really nice textbook that I have benefited a lot from, and that's by Samir Okasha in 2006, Evolution and the Levels of Selection. And he's pointing out something that I suppose is fairly intuitive, but nonetheless worth knowing about, worth considering, namely that we have ultimately these sort of genetic particles, we'll just call them genes for now, and there are levels of organization and bias that influence how those particles are passed on from one generation to the next below the level of the individual. So the obvious example in that case would be a chromosome. If you're two loci adjacent to each other on a chromosome will tend to, they're a bit more resistant to be broken up by meiosis, by the process of generating, separating chromosomes in the process of generating daughter gametes. And of course, all those chromosomes are brought together into an individual, and that individual in turn can have high-level effects that influence the fertility, the fitness of any individual. If your farmer puts you in a group with a lot of aggressive hens and you're a chicken, that's going to influence your capacity to have few eggs. And alternatively, if you end up in a nice group with lots of cooperative hens, subservient hens, I suppose I should say, then that has a very different effect. So this is the larger concept of multi-level selection. Okasha, in his 2006 textbook, makes a further distinction between two categories of multi-level selection 1 and multi-level selection 2. And if I remember correctly, at least on my slide, I wrote that Okasha, he is himself standing on the shoulders of others before him, and in this case, Damuth and Heisler in a paper from the late 80s. Multi-level selection 1 I find to be reasonably intuitive. Damuth and Heisler define it as the effects of group membership on individual fitness. Now, I would be amiss not to point out the legitimate objection that someone like John Maynard Smith made to this sort of proliferation of terminology, he perhaps would say jargon, insofar as that John Maynard Smith basically said, no, okay, you can call it whatever you want. This is still individual level selection. In other words, MLS1. It's still the unit of your explanatory terminology here is still the individual. This is basically frequency-dependent selection. And so Maynard Smith, in the review, actually, I think of Unto Others by Sober and Wilson in the late 90s, wrote that, this is just semantic, right? And I quote, this is Maynard Smith writing here, "The argument is not about what the world is like or even how we should model it, but it's about what words we should use to explain our model." So that's, that's a compelling point. I think, though, that Okasha is correct and Damuth and Heisler are correct to sort of consider actually that multi-level selection 1, it is useful as a group level concept distinct from individual level selection, even though it is, very, very connected to frequency dependence. And the reason for that is, well, I'll just read to you what Okasha wrote. I think he's right. For multi-level selection 1 can produce sustained evolutionary consequences. Insofar as these collectives, for example, a poultry farmer imposing his or her idea on how, the social nature of chickens, that can have profound effects across many, many generations on the fitness of those individual chickens. And you may have noticed here that I've switched my pictures of chickens up here to humanity itself. And so the same principle applies. Humanity has all sorts of groups above the level of the individual, whether you call them linguistic groups or social groups or socioeconomic groups. There are all sorts of ways that people congregate or not that has the potential to influence fitness at the individual level. And this, to my knowledge, is, there's no substantial difference between multi-level selection 1 applied to poultry farms and the individual level fitness consequences of humans congregating in one way or another, depending on their cultures and languages, etc. Because in both cases, multi-level selection 1, frequency dependence, can produce sustained evolutionary consequences because these collectives can persist over many, many generations. Multi-level selection 2 is a stronger claim about the relationship between groups and the units of how evolution acts, or the units on which evolution acts. And following Damuth and Heisler, they define it as the tendency for the groups themselves to go extinct or to found new groups, right? So group fitnesses. Okasha in his textbook writes, we may be interested in the collectives as evolving units in their own right, not just as part of the particle's environment. So that, the latter, right, part of the particle's environment, that's MLS1, multi-level selection 1. MLS2 is a bit stronger than that. And one example that Okasha cites in his textbook is this paper from the 80s by Jablonski, in which Jablonski argues, and I'm not saying he's right or wrong, I'm just repeating what the argument was, is that these are extinct Cretaceous mollusks, and he observed that there's a significant relationship between proximity, phylogenetically speaking, and geographic range. And according to him, this suggests that the trait geographic range is heritable at the species level. So 2 different kinds of multi-level selection operating above the level of the individual. So that's a bit of history and definition. I'd like now to get into Fisher's 1930 book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, and give you my interpretation of how Fisher, especially those last 5 chapters in his 1930 book, relate particularly to multi-level selection 1. In order to make that point, I want to share with you this general perception of Fisher 1930, which is that it's really 2 different books. There are the first 7 chapters, which are very quantitative, very difficult, certainly for me. It's very difficult to follow, frankly. It's very mathematical in orientation, but it's pretty much universally regarded as arguably the most important 7 chapters since Origin of Species. Because basically what Fisher did was demonstrate that using a Mendelian particulate pattern of inheritance, you can get evolution of diversity of the kind that we see on our planet. The last 5 chapters are different in the sense that they apply these principles, these Mendelian principles that Fisher discovered this hammer, and most problems in biology look to him like nail. So, he's very keen to use this new tool. But they're applying these Mendelian properties to human civilization. In particular, he wants to address this question: not only why do human civilizations collapse, but why do they rise? And he tries to do that via his Mendelian insights. Now, the problem comes in because Fisher, as he understood the term eugenics, was a huge fan. He was a champion of what he would use the term eugenics. Now, it's problematic because that word, eugenics, has shifted in its meaning. You remember when Fisher was an undergrad at Gonville and Keyes College at the University of Cambridge from about 1909 to 1911 or 1912, the atrocities of World War II obviously hadn't happened yet. I'm not, we'll get back to Fisher's sympathies or not with Nazi atrocities and later in the talk. Suffice it to say for now that these later chapters are viewed quite often in a rather negative way, to say the least. And I'll just, in the right part of my slide here, I have a bit of context for that. So, for example, in the more recent generation since World War II, these quotes from Stephen Jay Gould, for example, really sums it up. A tradition of discreet silence has enveloped these last 5 chapters from Fisher in 1930. Because he's really going to bat for eugenics, which for almost everyone reading that today just is this awful synonym with Nazi genocide. And no one wants to be associated with such a thing. Elliot Sober, in his 2024 book on page 112, refers to the first half of Fisher Genetical Theory, meaning chapters 1 through 7, as widely regarded as a masterpiece. That's true. The second is widely regarded as an embarrassment. This sort of pejorative view of Fisher's last 5 chapters was not shared prior to World War II, and this was something that is true across the political spectrum. So J.B.S. Haldane was a volunteer for the Republic side in the Spanish Civil War, a card-carrying communist, right, a total lefty. And in specific reference to Fisher's last 5 chapters, Haldane writes, Fisher has made out an extremely strong case. And Haldane goes on to say, well, if Fisher is right about the rise and fall of civilization, he really should be a communist like me. You could read that for yourself. But that's how I interpret what Haldane writes here. I thought this quote from Alan Graffin more recently is quite informative. He's one of the few who's not really afraid of those last 5 chapters, at least that I have that impression from reading this quote. There's so much still to emerge from the first 7 chapters of Fisher that it would be surprising if a close study of the remaining largely neglected chapters did not yield some important ideas. And I want to try and convince you that one of those important ideas is the application of multi-level selection 1 to human society, right? If you can get over that word eugenics, I think there are some important insights to come from the last 5 chapters of Fisher. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. Fisher's multi-level selection 1, his group selection, was based in how socioeconomic class interacts with fertility. So I've put in a red box the table of contents showing you the last 5 chapters, and I'll just read you a few things from Fisher to make this case. On page 245, Fisher writes that human evolution, at least in certain very ancient states of society, has proceeded by an agency much more powerful than the direct selection of individuals, namely the social promotion of fertility into the superior social strata. I mean, he's definitely a classist here. I think in the next couple of slides, I'll acknowledge, as I'm doing now, this, what I think to reasonable people today is not quite accurate. We don't go around today thinking that traits like bravery or work ethic, these things that civil society depends on, there's not a simple Mendelian basis of inheritance, and the environment has a huge influence on such things. And, the history of any royal family in Europe clearly demonstrates that socially valuable qualities are not that heritable. Fisher assumed perhaps too much along those lines, but you don't have to agree with any of these mistakes that Fisher made, whether it's with his positive view of eugenics, even taking into account that that word meant something a bit different post-war than pre-war. You don't have to agree with Fisher about the extent to which social traits are heritable. You still, however, can appreciate how his writings in the last 5 chapters apply what we today call multi-level selection, in particular multi-level selection 1. So here I'll just remind everyone that how Okasha defined multi-level selection 1, and this is something in which the role of the collective is to generate population structure for the particles, right? That's what Okasha refers to genes. And that affects the fitnesses of anything that's carrying those particles. For multi-level selection 1 to produce sustained evolutionary consequences, collectives must reappear regularly down the generations, right? That is the kind of frequency-dependent selection that when it is consistent across many generations, I think it's reasonable to call that multi-level selection 1. I don't have any problem calling that group selection, frankly. And whether it's referring to poultry farms or human civilizations, it's the same thing as far as I'm concerned. And once you look a bit more at several passages in these later chapters of Fisher, here we can see pretty clearly Fisher's discussion of altruism. He's presaging basically the debates that went on from the 60s onwards, but decades before, right? Selection of the heroic qualities in, non-Western human, perhaps hunter-gatherer societies he's talking about here. I mean, you have to get over his somewhat Victorian vocabulary. He's, when he's talking about a society as barbarous, it's not an insult. He's just talking about a non-industrialized society, perhaps something like hunter-gatherer or maybe early farmer, hard to be sure. But selection of the heroic qualities beyond the limits set by prudence, that's altruism, right? And then the next slide, Fisher's talking about kin selection. You select altruism by a method analogous to that used in chapter 7 to explain the evolution of distasteful qualities in insect larvae. That's what we discussed a few slides ago about, how it is that you can get toxicity to evolve in a butterfly by the fact that the brood mates, the litter mates of that caterpillar also have some of the distasteful qualities, and they're not being eaten by the predator. So when you get society derived generation after generation, predominantly from its more successful members, meaning that in what Fisher would call a tribal condition, reproductive success corresponds with social success. That was his idea of how societies rise. He was more famously, and I think inaccurately, characterized as being purely concerned with the fall of civilization. That's not true. He was concerned with both. But of course, he did write about the fall of civilization, and that's just the opposite. When population structure does, or it is a population structure in which socioeconomic success and reproductive success are opposed, right? So here on page 222, he writes, we face the paradox that biologically successful members of our society, in this case meaning, industrialized Britain, are to be found principally among its social failures, and equally that classes of persons who are prosperous and socially successful are, on the whole, biological failures. I mean, he's getting at some pretty difficult stuff to talk about. And again, you don't have to agree with the classist overtones here. It's still a multi-level selection 1 kind of argument. The social structures in which people live have implications for the individual fitness. It doesn't matter if he's right or wrong about heritability of social traits. Okay, there's a little bit more that I thought would be worth exploring as to why it is that, say, Sober and Wilson in 1999, among the other authors that I quoted a while ago, are pretty regularly attributing the gene's eye view to Fisher. I mean, it's not inaccurate to do that. He was famously concerned with what he called the fundamental theorem of natural selection, which really is about a relationship between evolutionary rate and diversity. But what ends up happening sometimes is that Fisher, is sort of viewed as the father of the gene's eye view. And one explanation for that, I think, is somewhat pedagogical. It reflects the way in which we teach evolutionary biology, and in particular population genetics. So what I'm showing you here is an analogy made a very influential analogy made and popularized by an early contemporary or a contemporary of Ronald Fisher by the name of Sewell Wright, who for most of his career worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he used the analogy of the adaptive landscape. So what you're looking at here are some, the trait values in 2 dimensions and the fitness of that particular combination of trait values in the y-axis here. And the higher up you are on what's called a fitness peak, the better off you're doing. Now, the problem arises when you're on a local peak. You're a species with a particular combination of traits that are doing really well, at least compared to the immediately adjacent possibilities, because it's so high up on that y-axis, but it's not the global peak. And the problem lies in this fact that in order to get to the global optimum, you have to cross a fitness valley. And yet, with a sufficiently large population size, selection is always going to pull you up. You can't cross that valley. Now, Sewell Wright made the case, and at least within the confines of this analogy, I think he's correct, that the only way to cross that fitness valley is when your population size goes down. That's a group level statement, right? So that's, I think, behind statements from Sober and Wilson in 1999. Wright thought that group selection was probably an important force in nature because when your group size is really small, when your effective population size is very small, the efficacy of selection, formal definition of which is NE, effective population size times S, that's a selection coefficient. If NE is really small, then selection is not going to act, or at least it won't be as strong. Drift takes over. Usually your population will go extinct, but over the course of evolutionary time, many do not, and you're able to cross a fitness valley. So this is a fundamentally group kind of argument incorporated into Sewell Wright's vision of evolution. The problem arises from the fact that, and I quote, Fisher detested the adaptive landscape formulation of natural selection. That's a quote from Frank and Slatkin back in the early 90s. The way we teach population genetics very often is Fisher versus Wright, because this antagonism that towards the ends of their career, by the 50s, apparently they wouldn't talk to each other, right? And this rivalry is very famous. And I think it's worth quoting a dear colleague of mine, Anthony Edwards, who has pointed this out on many occasions, one of which I'm quoting here in 2014. In associating the gene's eye view with Fisher's approach, it is necessary to avoid a common misunderstanding. Fisher was not simply attaching fitnesses to genes and ignoring all other questions of interaction and nonlinear components. In evaluating a population by its gene frequencies, Fisher was not ignoring its other features, but he was concentrating on the one defining feature capable of rigorous analysis, right? And Edwards, I think, is in that case referring to gene frequencies. It's a very genic view that Fisher has, but not because he ignored everything else. He wanted to take a sort of a physics view or a chemical view of evolution, and he wanted to come up with his evolutionary equivalent of the theory of gases, concentrating on these very reductionist aspects of what he wanted to explain, in that case, namely the genetic side of things. It doesn't mean that he discounted groups. So with that in mind, we can go back into some of the texts of Fisher 1930, the genetical theory, and it leads another reason why Fisher is generally not recognized or not viewed commonly in the literature as having contributed to this notion of multi-level selection or more simply group selection. And the reason for that, of course, is that Fisher is really hard to read. He's very concise, and speaking for myself, I read the same part over and over again, and if I ever understand it, which in some cases I never do, frankly, but the understanding happens on the 11th read, for example. So let's take, for example, this part of the 1999 posthumous publication of his second edition of Genetical Theory on page 280, where he's sort of saying both things. He's saying that group selection is unimportant. The relative unimportance of selection on gender or families, above the level of the individual, is the relative unimportance as an evolutionary factor would seem to follow from the small number of closer related species which in fact come into competition. And towards the end of that passage, he goes on to say, it may be doubted if it would be possible to point to any such character, meaning, a character that has arisen from a group level effect, inserting an incredibly important exception, with the possible exception of sexuality itself. Sexual reproduction, arguably the most important innovation of multicellular animals ever, expressly to increase evolutionary rate, possibly as an evolutionary arms race with parasites. That's another story. But here he's saying that actually sexuality itself, not sex ratios, not the maintenance of sex, but the origin of sex, could be interpreted as evolved for the specific rather than for the individual advantage. And I would suggest maybe this is an example of multi-level selection too, right? Where sex is a fundamentally supra-individual phenomenon. You need other members of your group to be able to reproduce in this way. And not only is it having implications for your fitness as an individual, but it's something fundamental. Inter-individuals are cooperating in order to outrun the parasites, if you believe the parasite theory of the origin of sex. So that's arguably an example I would suggest of multi-level selection 2. Multi-level selection 1, I think we've already covered, right? So that the quote I think I've already mentioned, an agency much more powerful than the direct selection of individuals, namely the social promotion of fertility into the superior social strata. Again, you don't have to agree with his use of the word superior here. For our purposes, all he's doing is pointing out that social conditions influence individual fitness, right? That's multi-level selection 1, hence my big red text here with that arrow. Okay. So for the last part of my talk, then, I want to talk about this window, right? For those of you who weren't around at the time, we're in the summer of 2020, June of 2020, a petition showed up on change.org from, I suppose it started from alums of Gonville and Keyes College at the University of Cambridge. This window had been in the hall at Keyes since 1989, or at least since the late 80s, and they demanded that it be removed. And it was removed. I think the petition showed up beginning of June 2020. By the end of June, the Keyes Council had agreed, and I don't know exactly what the timeline was, but it's not there anymore. I've been in Keyes Hall, and it's the portrait of Fisher isn't there anymore, and neither is this window. What did this petition say? Well, the substance of the petition is conveniently summarized by an emeritus professor of history at the University of Cambridge, a guy by the name of Richard Evans. I've never met him, but he did write in July 2020 an article in the New Statesman, and he quoted a part of the petition, right? So everything between these single quotes, the thing that I'm circling there and there, derives from or is drawn from, I've just pasted that in from Evans' 2020 article in the New Statesman, and I'll just read it to you here. A petition for the windows removal received more than 1,400 signatures, many of them present former college members. It objected in particular to Fisher's endorsements of colonialism, white supremacy, and eugenics in a 1930 publication, meaning Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, where he wrote that civilizations fail because people of low genetic value, read black and brown people, have more children than people with high genetic value, read white Europeans, and said that this was already happening in Great Britain, end quote. So like I said, everything between those single quotes appeared in Evans' article. You'll notice there is a subquote within that. That comes from a blog. If I remember, I'll put it in the comments window. As far as I know, it's still out there. And it was a blog post in 2016 by a guy named Joselson, and he wrote that. Now, Evans did not further explore the accuracy of that characterization. He did not further explore whether Fisher in 1930 really did endorse colonialism, white supremacy, and eugenics. I mean, we know he endorsed eugenics, but I'll come back to the other components of that. And I have to add again that the way in which Fisher understood the word eugenics was not the same as what that word means today. Anyways, that petition, as Evans' essay demonstrates, was widely appreciated by, for example, the BBC, who wrote that Fisher was known for arguing people were divided into genetically inferior and superior groups along racial lines. Varsity, that's the University of Cambridge undergraduate newspaper. It's run, as far as I know, it's run by varsity by undergrads here in Cambridge, and they wrote in an article in I believe that same summer, 2020, it is long past time for Cambridge to own up to its racist heritage and to end the glorification of white supremacy, and that. It was, I think, celebrating the decision by the Keys Council to remove the window. Okay, so what did Fisher actually write in the genetical theory? Is it true that he endorsed white supremacy? No, it is not true. In fact, the opposite is the case. So if you read page 239, Fisher is actually arguing against a real white supremacist, this guy, this French aristocrat by the name of Gobineau. And I'll just read to you a little bit from what Fisher wrote. Apart from Gobineau's assumption of the European origin of the rulers, he's talking about, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this already. Gobineau believed, he's a real white supremacist, he believed that the great civilizations of the earth, from ancient Egypt to to Eastern Asia, to any place where you get monumental architecture, Gobineau thought that this was because white Europeans are migrating out to the various parts of the world and telling the locals how to do it. That's what Gobineau thought. Fisher disagreed. Fisher writes, apart from Gobineau's assumption of the European origin of the rulers, the historical importance of such cases, meaning, ancient monumental architecture, cannot be doubted. That means he disagreed. Gobineau's assumption of the European origin of the rulers can be doubted. And Fisher goes on to write, if the peoples of the world's great centers of ancient population are inherently incapable of producing of themselves a great and vigorous civilization, an explanation of so remarkable a fact is certainly required. In other words, Gobineau did not provide an explanation. More explicitly, on page 176, Fisher writes, chapter 8, the experiment of becoming civilized, whether that's a good thing or not, actually Fisher never questioned that. But if you compare the small stature, lower life expectancy, higher frequency of infectious disease among early farming sedentary populations in human archaeology compared to the adjacent hunter-gatherers who are much healthier, it is open to question whether or not civilization is a good idea. Putting that to the side for a moment, Fisher, who clearly viewed civilization in a positive way, writes, this has been performed repeatedly, namely civilization, or the emergence of civilization, by peoples of very different races. Okay, so Fisher did not use a skin color-based criterion for his assessment of genetic value. He just didn't do that. That was wrong in the petition, and it was wrong in Evans' article in the New Statesman and the BBC coverage thereof. Now, I'm obliged to point out that Fisher held some ideas that are incorrect, particularly regarding what people used to think was a fundamentally biological nature of human ethnicities, right? So he really did believe, and we've mentioned this already, he really did believe that traits such as heroism, bravery, work ethic, etc., in addition to fertility itself, were heritable to some degree. Now, nothing in our existence, in the existence of any living thing, is completely environmental or completely genetic. I mean, by definition, anything that's, hatches from an egg has this interplay between nature and nurture. They're always ineluctably meshed together, right? So there's nothing that's pure nature and nothing that's pure nurture. But Fisher clearly was leaning on the side of genetics in his assessment of evolution. And I think in the context of writing about all this stuff in the first half of the 20th century, we got to cut him a little slack, frankly. I'm prefacing this awful statement, though, a bit too much. So the impatient among you, the people who are never convinced that any of this is right, will be reading the bit there that I have in my red box here, and you'll all be horrified, and rightfully so. Fisher believed in some pretty awful stuff. Like, for example, I'll just quote this, groups of mankind differ in their innate capacity for intellectual and emotional development, right? I'm not denying that for a nanosecond. But I will point out that he writes this stuff at a time in human intellectual history when the African origins of our species had yet to be, there was an inkling of that. The Leakeys had been in East Africa. The Robert Broom and many others had been in South Africa. We kind of had an inkling that there was a great fossil record in Africa. But the notion that anatomically modern Homo sapiens is this invasive species from Africa that's since spread out to the rest of the world was pretty far in the future from Fisher's perspective, even towards the end of his life. So it's really, I don't know, I want to convince you guys that it's important to not to project our own sense of social right and wrong to a time when prevailing ideas about our own species and its place in nature were different in pretty substantial ways. So the context of this letter was in preparation to publish this book, the UNESCO Statement on Race. Fisher's opinion was solicited for this, and I might add, this is a screenshot of a letter that's publicly available from, I think, where is this? This American Philosophical Society. You can see the link right there, that you can see this letter in its original form for yourself. And Fisher's not writing this in a book. It's not written for public consumption. I mean, I don't know if he even knew that this was going to be, his own correspondence was going to be widely available for people like us to scrutinize decades later. Had he known that, maybe he would have worded things differently. On the other hand, Fisher was notoriously an iconoclast. Maybe he wouldn't have cared that way or the other. I'll never know, frankly, one way or the other. But it is worth remembering, this is private correspondence. He's not writing this, as far as I know, or I think anyone knows, he's not writing this in the anticipation that it's going to be scrutinized by generations of historians of science. Okay, another aspect of Fisher's legacy that gets trotted out in a really pejorative way is Fisher's relationship with this guy. This is a former Nazi by the name of Ottmar Verschuer, he joined the Nazi Party a bit late, actually, in 1940. I think he was a member of the SS, and most damningly, this guy Verschuer was one of the mentors of Joseph Mengele, right? The angel of death at the Auschwitz concentration camp. So Verschuer was a real bastard, certainly, during the war. And what you end up getting in the sort of post-Fisher window, Fisher must fall controversy is frequent associations of Fisher with Verschuer and then of Verschuer with Mengele, to the point where the reader is left thinking, oh, Fisher was a big fan of Joseph Mengele, right? So, for example, Adam Rutherford, in a 2021 paper in American Journal of Physical Anthropology, writes that Fisher also defended the former Nazi scientist Ottmar Freiherr Verschuer. And during the war, Verschuer worked with Joseph Mengele, and they used samples obtained from Jews murdered in concentration camps. Verschuer was never convicted of war crimes, reinventing himself as a geneticist after the war, but remained a eugenicist until his death in 1969. Right? He's talking about Verschuer there. Fisher, died in 1962. Whether Fisher was fully aware of Verschuer's direct associations with Nazi experimentation on people is not known. What an association to leave the reader to mull over there, isn't it? Richard Evans, in a very similar vein, writes, Fisher remained on friendly terms with Verschuer after the war. There was publicity given to Verschuer's close collaboration with Mengele, of which Fisher cannot have been ignorant. Right. Quite a association here. So was Fisher really a Nazi sympathizer? Well, I've sort of chosen this photo somewhat deliberately because it shows Fisher with his two sons. George, the older of the two sons, died as a Royal Air Force pilot during the war, I think 1942 or 43, right around the time when Fisher moved from London to Cambridge. I hate to implicate his sons with this association with Nazis. Obviously, it didn't have anything to do with it. And indeed, George was fighting Nazis, although I think George, it's all written down in Joan Box Fisher's biography of her father, that George's death was actually, I think, on a training mission in South Africa. It wasn't, while he was bombing, who knows, Verschuer's office in Berlin. That didn't happen. But in any event, there is another letter that I'm obliged to share with you, that is often quoted by the people really keen to associate Fisher with Nazism. And this was to the dean of the medical faculty in Frankfurt after the war. So we're talking 1948. And this was a time when Germany is coming to grips with the class of professionals, technocrats, any society needs competent people to run its universities and civil service and police, et cetera, et cetera. And, you can't put every single former German soldier in jail. The society has to go on. And so they have this process to figure out, were you complicit like, Goebbels and Hitler himself? Were you high up in the Nazi hierarchy, in which case, no thanks, go to jail or we'll hang you at the gibbet, like many of the former high-ranking brass did at the Nuremberg trials. Verschuer kind of snuck under the radar for a little bit, but he was evaluated. And part of that evaluation, because he wanted to return into the academic fold, he was applying for jobs in Germany after the war. This guy, Wetzler, is the dean of the medical faculty. He's writing to people outside of Germany and asking them, in this case Fischer, who was this guy Verschuer? Was he any good? Was he an awful Nazi? What do you think? And Fischer responded very positively. And I'll just read to you, and this is all part of the record. Deborah Faith Weiss, in an article in 2010, published this stuff, right? So Fischer's letter to Wetzler in 1948 goes something like, I guess I won't read the whole thing. It was, I think, Verschuer's misfortune rather than his fault that racial theory was a part of Nazi ideology. So Fischer's very sympathetic. And he makes an even stronger statement in Verschuer's defense. He writes, Fischer's writing, I have no doubt also that the party, meaning the Nazi party, sincerely wished to benefit the German racial stock, especially by the elimination of manifest defectives, such as those deficient mentally, and I do not doubt that von Verschuer gave, as I should have done, his support to such a movement. Now, this is pretty difficult to read. It seems to imply that Fischer is saying, I would have done the same thing. I would have sent, gypsy and Jewish children to their deaths in a concentration camp. Anyone deficient mentally, I guess, it sounds really awful. You have to keep in mind a couple things. One was pointed out in an essay by Anthony Edwards quite recently in Oxford Magazine, the citation here, that this phrase manifest defectives is something that crops up in reference to genetic alleles in the parlance of population genetics of the early mid 20th century. He's not talking about eliminating people in that phrase. He's talking about eliminating alleles. Now, it's hard to join that with the next clause, such as those deficient mentally. That does sound like he's talking about someone with some sort of, cognitive defect, right? But he's still using that phrase manifest defectives. And again, this is personal correspondence. We don't know if Fischer pored over every word of this, thinking, how is my legacy going to be perceived in later generations? Almost certainly did not pore over it for any length of time. He dictated, and his secretary would have put this down in the course of a few minutes. I mean, who knows? I'm speculating there. Nonetheless, manifest defective, the way that phrase was used by Fischer and generally elsewhere, was in reference to alleles, not people. And I'll defer to Anthony's essay in Oxford Magazine if you want to read more about that. There's another part to this story that you guys should know, which has to do with the other letters of support that Verschuer received. And one of them was written by this guy, Richard Goldschmidt. Now, Goldschmidt he may have even been Verschuer's predecessor at one of these Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. That's in turn the predecessor of what eventually turned into the Max Planck Society. Goldschmidt might have been Verschuer's predecessor at this Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And Goldschmidt also wrote a letter of support to the dean of the medical faculty in Frankfurt. And I want to give my thanks to Malcolm Smith, another fellow at Keys, who shared with me the original German of this letter of Goldschmidt to Wetzler, written in December of 1948. And I have the original German here. I'll just translate it for you. Professor Verschuer is an outstanding scholar in his field and one of the most knowledgeable of human genetic pathology. I don't know exactly what he did after 1935. I've heard from German colleagues that he was involved in this Nazi pseudoscience, but I know how difficult it would have been to call yourself a human geneticist without making concessions, to the ruling party. So that the problem becomes if he was carried along or if he really was actively participating in what Goldschmidt calls pseudoscience. And did I mention, by the way, that Goldschmidt was not only was Goldschmidt Jewish and had to escape, for his life, but the Nazis used his family as direct propaganda. And I'll put, if I remember, I'll put in the comments window a link to a poster that the Imperial War Museum in Duxford has on their website showing the Goldschmidt family, and it's all about Jewish conspiracies, etc. So Richard Goldschmidt is this victim, right? And here he too is going to bat for Verschuer, right? So where was I? Right, when Verschuer, writes Goldschmidt, when he's writing about the extraordinary deeds of our Führer, you don't know, those of you who are outside, you don't really know if he actually means that himself or if someone else is adding it, right? When Verschuer is still the same gentleman that I knew, then I would believe what he himself has to say. This is a clearly positive letter of support that Goldschmidt is writing for Verschuer. And I think that's really important to keep in mind before rushing to judgment based on this other letter that Fischer wrote to Wetzler that's very positive for Verschuer. Okay, and the last bit of correspondence, or the last kind of historical context that I think is really important to know in regards to this claim, that I'll just go back to the original one, say, for example, from Richard Evans. This is a historian from the University of Cambridge who specializes in the history of Nazi Germany in the early mid-20th century, as far as I know. Evans is writing Verschuer's close collaboration with Mengele. Fischer cannot have been ignorant of that, right? Rutherford writes that whether Fischer was fully aware of Verschuer's direct associations with Nazi experimentation on people is not known, dangling that guilt by association before the reader. So let's go to this final example here that I thought would be worth pointing out. This is from a sort of an account of the post-war life of Joseph Mengele, who survived the war. Not only that, he was actually in an American prisoner of war camp in the summer of 1945 under his own name. He didn't have an SS tattoo on him, if I remember correctly, from this Posner and Ware book from 1986. And so he was regarded by the Americans in that POW camp as, hoi polloi. They let him go. And he managed to escape under an assumed name from Italy, and he spent out the rest of his days between Argentina and Brazil up until the late 70s. Mengele did. There's a really interesting story from one of the Mossad agents pictured here, Zvi Aharoni. This was one of the Mossad agents who captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in 1960. And here's what he writes. I don't think that I had even heard of who Mengele was at that stage. His name hadn't surfaced in the newspapers. So basically what happened in 1960 is that the government of Israel was telling its agents in Buenos Aires, okay, you've got Eichmann. Can you find this other guy, Mengele, as well? And Aharoni is saying, who? Because he never heard of the guy, The publicity around Joseph Mengele really came to the fore from the mid to late 50s. I think, if I remember correctly from the Posner and Ware book, Mengele lived under his own name in Argentina and Brazil. He had a West German passport in his own name, and it wasn't until the mid-50s that West Germany finally issued an arrest warrant for Joseph Mengele. Now, remember, we're not talking about Verschuer here. The claim from people like Rutherford and Evans here is that Fischer knew Verschuer, Verschuer knew Mengele, therefore Fischer, they phrase it very conveniently. We don't know if Fischer approved of Nazi experimentation. Well, it's a really tenuous association. I think if the Israeli Mossad in 1960 never heard of Mengele, how on earth is Ronald Fischer supposed to have known of Mengele when he wrote a letter of support in 1948? Not to mention the fact that Goldschmidt writes a letter of support that same year. Someone who obviously has no reason to say anything nice about Verschuer, given his his own persecution. I mean, Goldschmidt wrote his letter based on his positive view of Verschuer's scholarship. Evidently, Fischer had a positive view too. We shouldn't condemn Fischer on that basis alone. Okay, I will summarize this whole talk now. First, the chapters on human society and the genetical theory, in my opinion, come very close to foreshadowing what we call today multi-level selection theory, including ideas of group selection in both its MLS1 and MLS2 forms. I would add that the multi-level selection 1, that is really the basis of all of his last 5 chapters. It's not an embarrassment. It's an application of multi-level selection 1, and I think we should study it and appreciate it on that basis. And again, you don't have to agree with the rather naive extent to which Fisher thought social traits were heritable in a Mendelian pattern. 2, Fisher is widely credited as the father of the gene's eye view, but this does not mean that he discounted group-level effects. His antipathy to the role of small groups in Wright's adaptive landscape, well, that could be why he's often portrayed as antagonistic to group selection. Maybe I'd rephrase that a little bit. His antipathy to Wright's adaptive landscape, really, and that has implications for the role of small groups. With the way we teach population genetics, contrasting Fisher and Wright might have something to do with the fact that Fisher's rarely, if ever, viewed as being sympathetic towards multi-level selection. And it's true, finally, that Fisher was an active supporter of eugenics, as that word was understood for most of his life, up until the end of World War II, when it became clear what eugenics might look like in practice, which is this, no sensible human being, and forgive me for stating the obvious, is going to approve of mass murder on the scale of the Nazis. And I honestly don't think that Ronald Fisher approved of that at all, frankly. So he didn't explicitly distance himself from that, but Fisher did post-war. But at the same time, he never endorsed white supremacy or Nazism, at least in his published writings, and that finally there's little evidence for the claim that Fisher knew, and much less approved, of the torture of concentration camp victims by Joseph Mengele. I don't think Fisher was a Nazi. And that's actually a really awful note to end on, because Ronald Fisher is really one of the most important figures in the history of evolutionary biology. All of this, our understanding, or much of the understanding that's happened since 1930, is on the shoulders of Ronald Fisher. And I think on that positive note, I'll end this talk. So thanks for listening.